Okay, so welcome to part two of Werner Herzog, Ecstatic Truth and the Documentary Sublime. In the first part of this lecture, I discussed the concepts of the beautiful and the sublime, as well as Herzog's own development of his notion of ecstatic truth. In this second part, we will be turning to his two films, Lessons of Darkness, released in 1992, and his 2005 documentary film Grizzly Man, and exploring just a little bit of how the ecstatic notion of ecstatic truth and the sublime play out in these two films. So, Lessons of Darkness. Well, very famously, the film opens with a quote attributed to the French philosopher Blaise Pascal. And in this quote, translated into English, Pascal is said to have written, "The collapse of the stellar universe will occur like creation in grandiose splendor." Now, in point of fact, this text was written by Herzog himself, but he makes no clear mention of this in the film. This is another instance of that imagination or imaginativeness and constructedness that I discussed in the previous half of this lecture, in which Herzog is attempting to get at a greater sense of truth or to provoke something in the object, and thus to generate a feeling in the viewer for something eschatological, right? Again, if this notion of the eschatological applies to the sense of human life, the greater meaning of human life when it reaches some sort of end point or reaches some sort of point of decision. It's sort of at the end of history, as it were, or mundane or ordinary history as we know it, and we're entering something kind of cosmic, and entering something on a grander scale than any one individual life or any sort of mundane sense of fact, and entering into this more expansive and capacious, ecstatic sense of truth with the very opening of this attribution to Pascal about the nature of the end of the universe. And so this is why in his essay on the absolute, the sublime, ecstatic truth, Herzog writes, "Why am I doing this? Why have I attributed this quote to Pascal, you might ask? The reason is simple and comes not from theoretical, but in fact rather from practical considerations. With this quotation as a prefix to the film, I elevate the spectator, before he has even seen the first frame, to a high level from which to enter the film, and I, the author of the film, do not let him descend from this height until it is over. Only in this state of sublimity does something deeper become possible, a kind of truth that is the enemy of the merely factual, ecstatic truth, as I call it." And so Herzog here seems to be positioning the viewer in the figure of this wanderer, right? This wanderer in Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer above the Sea of Fog, elevating us into this condition where we are contemplating the sort of mysterious metaphysical expanse as a kind of the universe, of the world, and then having this incredible feeling of ultimately, in the Kantian sense, of power, in fact, of confronting something incredible, and thereby feeling our own sense of power as we confront it and engage our faculties of imagination as a response. And this provokes, in his reading of the film, Lessons of Darkness, Matthew Gandy to write that Herzog, quote, "reveals a realm of aesthetic experience that lies beyond our imaginative expectations. He seeks to surprise or confound his audience through the use of cinematic imagery as a kind of aesthetic transcendence that instills thoughts and sensations that are not easily conveyed through conventional narrative structures." And if we remember, the film Lessons of Darkness is structured into 13 parts, I believe, 13 different, and almost in a kind of musical structure based based around the structures of the 19th century composer and artist Richard Wagner, another sort of romantic artist who developed, among other things, the concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, right, which would be these massive operas that had music, right, of course, lighting, that we try to embrace all the various dimensions of art, sculpture, and so forth, poetry, all into one sort of total experience. And in some sense, this is what Herzog is attempting to achieve inside of the realm of this documentary film, Lessons of Darkness. and to bring us up to this sort of sublime, into this sublime experience, this ecstatic truth, as it were. And so this again takes us to Herzog, who writes of um, the film Lessons of Darkness, quote, after the first war in Iraq, as the oil fields burned in Kuwait, the media, and here I mean television in particular, was in no position to show what was, beyond being a war crime, an event of cosmic dimensions, a crime against creation itself. There was not a single frame in Lessons of Darkness in which you can recognize our planet, and for this reason the film is labeled science fiction, as if it could only have been shot in a distant galaxy hostile to life. So here in this statement, Herzog is in part justifying and responding to his critics who said that he is sort of dehistoricizing or aestheticizing the the real violence against people as well as nature, the environment, the burning oil, and so forth in the film. The way he seems to have aestheticized it, right? He is trying to respond by saying, well, we have so many images that we have in the news, that these infinitely reproduced images on the nightly news, that actually those are actually the things that banalize, that minimize what is going on, really, that ultimately minimize the effects and the crimes of what's happened here. And Herzog seems to be suggesting the only way to really get at the nature of the crime and the oddity and the power of what happened there is through this artifice, in this case the artifice of science fiction, to achieve the sort of greater truth, the ecstatic truth that he's looking for, and to approach the depth of the crimes of the against nature, I suppose, in this case. And so we have this many images throughout the film where Herzog is not just showing us landscapes, but also these figures dwarfed by the landscape, much like Monk by the Sea, Caspar David Friedrich's painting that we saw in the first half of this lecture. And Herzog, through a conjunction of the music and as well as in particular his voiceover, seems to want to be showing us these alien figures, right? So on a factual level, these are figures, these are firemen who are working to put out the fires. But in Herzog's narrative, the way he uses and deploys the footage, the way he perhaps aestheticizes the footage and takes it up into his own ecstatic truth, wants to be showing us these figures as these kind of strange aliens and their own, sort of ultimately unfathomable rituals to us, these sort of would-be anthropologists, perhaps, who are encountering this alien species and its gestures and rituals and practices and so forth. Perhaps there are sort of fire people that we are witnessing in Herzog's sort of ecstatic vision of the burning oil fields of Kuwait. And in the first sequence of the film, Gandhi describes it as, quote, entitled simply A Capital City, there is an aerial view of an unspecified city as if to underlie the universalist import of the unfolding events. And this is a city in Kuwait, the capital city, and it's a sort of a modern Muslim city, but it is also sort of in Herzog's sort of again, sort of sci-fi, aestheticized, neo-romantic approach to this. We have it sort of defamiliarized to us and becomes this, again, a sort of alien environment. And we can ask ourselves to what extent Herzog, is exoticizing something from a sort of Eurocentric position, right? And again, sort of a neo-colonial, there might be perhaps vestiges of a neo-colonial project in Herzog's very attempt to escape from history, right, in order to produce this cosmic vision of, the end of the universe or this cosmic war that happened in a far-off place. There may be actually sort of this neo-colonial unconscious that may be operating in it. And this is why this is in part what Matthew Gandhi is getting at when he writes that, quote, Herzog's interest in dystopian science fiction landscapes can be read as a metaphor for the end of modernity, an eschatological fantasy of redemption that eschews the possibilities for progress. And here, of course, he cites Frederick Jameson's famous writings on postmodernism. But Gandhi goes on, there is a tragic inevitability about Lessons of Darkness, which conveys these landscapes of disaster not as the outcome of neo-imperial conquest in the Middle East, but rather as a fatalistic denouement for modernity. So again, right, so Gandhi's getting at here is that when Herzog transforms these images into this ecstatic truth, this eschatological vision of a sort of the end of the material universe, cosmic worlds as we know it. Um, there is this sense of inevitability, but we miss, of course, and this is Herzog, I think, in a way, acknowledges this. We miss, of course, the very real sort of historical dimensions of neo-imperialism, struggles over oil, of the warring nations and so forth, American imperial interests in the Gulf region that were playing themselves out. But of course, Herzog would say, well, that was all captured in the nightly news, and it becomes itself its own banality that we become almost desensitized to, and we need works like Lessons of Darkness and the aestheticization, its romantic vision of the end of the universe and so forth, in order to re-see the world again, to re-see nature, the environment, our relationship to it, and so forth. So this is the kind of struggle I think we need to think about when we watch a work, this kind of political and aesthetic struggle we need to think about when we watch a work like Lessons of Darkness.